Well, hello and welcome to the Theotivity podcast. My name is Thaddeus and I'm glad that you've joined me for this episode. I'm super excited about this episode and the guest that I have with me, a longtime friend and, just really has blessed my life and my family's life with the work that she's doing, none other than Deanna McLeod. And I just want you guys to get to hear a little bit of what she has to say, some of her expertise on a very important topic, which we may not be able to post this whole episode on YouTube, but we'll post the whole thing on Rumble. So make sure that you get it there if we have to cut it off here.
The Theotivity Podcast. Theotivity is the place where theology and creativity come together. Here you'll find audio narration of articles, episodes exploring the faith, culture, the arts and media, systematic theology, apologetics, guest interviews with Christian thinkers, creatives, pastors, theologians, and much more. At theotivity.com, you'll find articles and resources to help you grow in your faith, as well as a portfolio of creative works. Like, share, and subscribe to stay up to date on the latest content.
So, Deanna, how about you tell the folks who are listening a little bit about yourself, maybe about your background, some of your qualifications, and why you think that the most important thing to understand in all of this is that pineapple belongs on pizza.
Because that's exactly what you told me we should talk about is making pizza for sure.
That's all this episode is. It's a very
That's
innocent
right.
episode.
Exactly. And that's why we're going to be highly censored. I'm 100% sure that's it. Right
Exactly.
there.
Yeah, those YouTube censors do not like pineapple on pizza. That's why you can't trust
No,
them.
exactly. Well, Thad, thanks for having me on your show. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you and your audience, first of all. So my name is Deanna McLeod, and I'm the principal of a medical research firm called Kaleidoscope Strategic. And our firm specializes in doing literature reviews and summarizing that data. And we work with the leading cancer specialists across Canada. My company has been doing reviews, systematic reviews, guidelines, and supporting doctors and doing those for almost 25 years now. So it's been a long time. We've read a lot of studies and we've published a lot of studies. So our firm's actually about to publish its 50th systematic review. And so
congrats. That's
so
a lot of
that's a
achievement.
that's a peer-reviewed publication. All of them are peer-reviewed publications. And so in each one of those reviews, we'd probably have to, evaluate and critically review about anywhere between 5 and 25 studies in depth. And we do that with the top doctors, top specialists in cancer. So that would be somebody who's done their, undergrad and then, gone and done medicine and then done a fellowship and then has probably done, a few more years. We're looking at about people who've been in school for 10 years post-grad. So, really smart people. And so we kind of work with them and we evaluate them. So we've been trained by them. And just to kind of give some context in terms of, the type of studies and the type of evaluations we do, I'm a Cochrane author. So that's like an evidence-based review. So if you're published there, that means that you kind of know what you're doing when you're looking at studies. And my first publication was in the Lancet, and that's an impact factor of 50. So just to kind of get a sense of the types of areas and places that we play in terms of clinical evaluation, that's kind of our level. And so we've generally worked in cancer research, and I've really enjoyed that because it gives a real breadth of understanding. We understand basic science, how certain agents and certain things turn on molecular pathways. We translate that into early preclinical science. We understand those studies all the way through to clinical research, phase 3 studies, and even real world data. So it's been a lot of fun because we have a very strong, breadth of understanding in terms of medicine and how it works. But you asked more recently, what we've been into. And so we've been doing a lot more research in the related area. So we kind of did a little bit of a jump from the standard cancer over to or infectious disease, specifically as it relates to some of the non-pharmaceutical interventions that were recommended, in the early part of and then more recently into the clinical trial data related to So we've done a little bit of a shift. Honestly, infectious disease is a walk in the park compared to cancer. The studies are a lot less complicated and a lot less sophisticated
Mm.
than what we're used to seeing. And so it's not a stretch at all to start to evaluate that data and weigh it out. So yeah, that's what we've been into more recently, and a lot of the concerns or the reason for the shift was mostly because what we found is that when you're making a recommendation or developing a guideline, what you want to make sure is that you have the evidence, the
Mm.
level of science. Not all science is the same. That the quality of the studies is sufficient to support the claims that you're making. So if
Mm.
you were to say something like masks work, you know, you would actually have to have very strong evidence to support that claim. And then you'd have
Mm.
to have strong evidence in the manner in which you plan on using it to support that claim. And so, for instance, the early parts of the pandemic, we were noticing that claims were being made that weren't sufficiently supported by robust
Mm.
enough studies, and that
Yeah.
they were extrapolating their recommendations beyond the nature in which the studies were being done. And so that was a little bit concerning. And it was happening fairly consistently right across the board.
Mm.
And so then we kind of started jumping in and wanting to really get in and evaluate those studies to see if the data was sufficiently robust to support the claims that were being made.
Right. So glad that you guys were doing that work too. And just to point out, like this is not like a group of let's say social media researchers who are just like looking up Instagram memes or something to research. These are serious, scientists and well qualified people on your team and people who you've been partnering with to do this research. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, great. So, what are some of the principles? You're not only a medical researcher, but you're also a Christian, a follower of the Lord. What are maybe some Christian approaches to thinking about medicine and this topic of healing in general? Because the Bible has something to say about that. And I just wanted to hear from you before we jump into some of the meat of dissecting some of the evidence around those topics that you mentioned already. Like, how does your faith inform the way that you approach your job as a medical researcher?
Mhm. Oh, I think it's multifaceted. But I
Mm.
think the parts that were most compelling for me in the last 3 years, were, to practice the principle of do no harm, which
Mm.
is really to seek the wellness and well-being of your neighbor, and it's, the command to
Mm.
love others, right? Um,
Mhm.
and one of the things that happens if you recommend a drug that isn't properly tested in terms of safety, isn't sufficiently tested in terms of safety, then you can't, in any good conscience, actually say that it's safe if it isn't safe for everybody. And so, great diligence and care in ensuring that there's something that's safe and ensuring that the validity of that statement is true,
Mm.
is the very basis for ensuring that what you're recommending and what you're standing for, supporting, is actually loving your
Mm.
neighbor. And so, what I
Yeah.
see is that truth and love go hand in hand in this particular
Mm.
area, because unless you take the time to ensure that they're telling the truth, then you actually aren't helping when you recommend or participate in a given endeavor, whether it's being
Mm.
endorsed or not. It's not the authority by which the commandment is given. Like in the Old Testament or in the New Testament, Caesar can give an edict and he has great
Mm.
authority, but it doesn't mean that it's true or it will be for the well-being of the people. And so I think as Christians, we need to basically make sure that we're very diligent in ensuring that something is true before we participate in it. And I think even more so today, as multiple versions of truth emerge, and often with competing interests. And the interests are not always aligned with the well being of others. There's financial and ideological interests and political interests that can intersect and compete with doing
Mm.
good and
Mm.
looking out for the well being of your neighbors. So I think that one is probably something that needs to be considered by all people. And, it's so funny when I engage with Christians and I start to talk in that way, they're like, well, I don't know. Like, how do I know this study? I mean, if, I trust the experts, what are you talking about? But
Right.
I really think that there's a level of discernment that we all have and that common sense goes a long way. Like for instance, just one simple thing, like how can they recommend a for instance, that they don't know that hasn't been studied yet, right? if you start
Yeah.
recommending a product 4 to 5 months before it's actually produced, you need to actually test it thoroughly before you actually know that it can be true. Or if you need to test something for 10 years and it's tested for 1 year, then you could probably reason through that the testing hasn't been sufficiently conducted, that they haven't conducted sufficient safety testing. Right?
Yeah,
Like,
and
just
that's really base level common sense sort of thing. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And
Mhm.
what I think happens is that
Mm.
um there's the powers that be basically appeal to authority, and it's a low level argument. They appeal to
Mm.
emotion and they appeal to authority. And so if you ever
Yeah.
feel people, heavily relying on, well, the expert says, or the science says, or Fauci says, or anybody says, it doesn't matter anybody, I would highly be suspicious, because it's not who is delivering the message that should be
Mm.
scrutinized. It's the message itself.
Yeah.
And if somebody has to do an appeal to emotion, especially appeal to fear,
Mm.
or if there's any type of coercion involved where they're requiring or mandating something and making a basic livelihood conditional on it, then if they have to coerce, then it's probably not good in and of itself.
Mm.
Like, those are
Yeah.
just basic things you can probably engage in terms of everyday logic. And I really
Mhm.
feel that today, more than any time else, there's a lot of appeal to authority where
Yeah.
they're saying, you don't know, you're not the expert. And I really think that we need to push back against that as Christians,
Mm.
because God's given us a spirit, his truth,
Mm.
the spirit of truth,
Yeah.
right? Or
Amen.
sorry, the
That's so
Holy
good.
Spirit, which is
And
his
you
spirit,
know,
which is
it's
the spirit of truth.
Yeah, and that's so in line with, like, just New Testament Christianity, right? That you see even the apostles themselves, like, it wasn't just the authority that they had in themselves, even though they were inspired. It was the message that they kept on pointing back to, right? Like Paul even encouraged and gave commendations to the Bereans, for example, for examining the scriptures, right? So there is this ethos, so to speak, in Christianity of wanting to be a people of the truth because we follow one who is the truth, right? So these
Hmm.
things matter as Christians, and I think it's good. It was one of the encouraging things for me in all of this was to see how many people who were pushing back against the mainstream narrative and the whole trust in the expert sort of rhetoric that was being used were actually a lot of Christians. I don't know if you noticed that, but maybe speak to that a little bit. Like, did you find that there were a lot of, like, within the professional medical sort of sphere and the research sort of sphere, that a lot of the people who were seeing these things and raising issues and maybe having the courage to speak out even at risk of their jobs, that there was a faith component to that a lot of times?
Well, let me just put it this way, is that, and
Mm.
to my shame, maybe, if you're in the sciences or in the medical field, you don't talk about your faith too much. It's not like you don't have it,
Mm.
but you might operate in alignment with it, but it's not something that's front and center in terms of the way that you talk,
Mm.
and the way that you exchange ideas. And so, for that reason, you probably don't know and you can't identify other Christian scientists very easily.
Mm.
It's interesting because during all of a sudden, I felt very strongly compelled to speak the truth, because I felt that people were being deceived, and that they were being asked to do something that could be harmful to them. And so, out of compassion and love for my neighbor, I wanted to sacrifice myself and my reputation and my income and my company, because I wanted to make sure that people weren't hurt. So that
Mm.
was where it was coming from for me.
Mm.
I know just how much God loves people and how much he seeks their well-being. And as his follower, I needed to do the same thing. But interestingly enough, as I stepped out there, and there were a few of us, I actually started to recognize that the other people who were willing to make that step too, and that were willing to sacrifice for the well-being of the general public. And some people did have,
Mm.
it cost a lot. Were also people of faith and people who
Oh,
of compassion. And
yeah.
interestingly enough, we have a whole group of us scientists who actually pray regularly now through,
Mm.
all the various challenges related to. And so, God is so good that he's also given us community, in the midst of it. And I didn't have that before. I didn't have a Christian community of scientists that I could, study and pray with.
That's so awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And that it's interesting because for me, it has a little bit of I'm primarily more of a theologian than I am. I wouldn't even pretend to be a scientist. But like, that has a lot of interesting parallels for me when you think about like the authenticity of, let's say, like the Gospels and the early Christian testimony. A lot of them, the reason why we have such high confidence with that is that it cost them so much. Like so many Christians lost their lives to give testimony to the fact that Jesus Christ rose again. Actually, that word martyr actually comes from the Greek word, which just means to be a witness. And it took on that shade of meaning to lose your life for a truthful witness later on because of Christians who were willing to sacrifice much just to bear witness to the truth. And in a way, like you're seeing something of that. I mean, not calling you guys martyrs or anything like that. It's not to that level. But there's a certain level of credibility that you have to give when people are willing to risk a lot of loss for the sake of something they truly believe is true. Now, they could be genuinely wrong, but at least you could say, well, these people are at least genuine because they're willing to risk something for it.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And it was interesting, but I was reading First John and looking at a number of versions of it and considering the meaning of various words. And I noticed that he would interchange love and sacrifice, right? Love one another,
Yeah.
sacrifice for one another, love one another, sacrifice. I'm like, oh my gosh, the essence of love is sacrifice. It's giving yourself away for the well-being of somebody else, right?
Yeah.
And so I count it a privilege to be able to do that and to give what I have, and even at cost to myself and to my family, in order that people will be protected and guarded against this, and also that they would become aware and more discerning in what they allow themselves to be guided in.
Mm-hmm. So good. All right, so I'm gonna shift this conversation a little bit, and this is probably a point at which I'll have to stop it on YouTube. But in the past few years, it's kind of exposed a lot of things about the pharmaceutical industry to a lot of people who perhaps were in the past a little bit more ignorant towards this, including myself. Due to the sensitive nature of this topic, we will not be able to discuss the full extent of it on YouTube. So if you'd like to listen to or watch the rest of this episode, make sure to catch it at theotivity.com/podcast, or you can check it out on video on rumble.com/theotivity, or you can listen to the audio only on your favorite podcast app. Just look for Theotivity Podcast. Thanks.